Well, I think what led me to science was a sense of wonder at the beauty of nature. And I think that made me both love nature, but it also made me wonder whether there was something deeper that lay behind nature that could be discovered. And my initial response was to say, well, there is not. There is simply what we observe. And so I was very radically atheist as a young man. But I gradually began to realize that actually what I was looking for was a big picture of reality, which would both make sense of science, but also give me a deeper and more satisfying vision of reality itself. And that's how I came to realize that science and faith in God could come together to give you a deeper and richer understanding of our world. Well, I think that what theology tries to do is uncover the rationality of faith and try to explain what the building blocks of faith look like, how the various ideas are connected together. And for me, that's very exciting and very fascinating. But I think our culture doesn't really understand theology. And therefore, one of the major conversations that we need to have at the moment is a conversation which involves the rationality of faith and also the multiple rationalities we find in contemporary culture. And this used to be thought of simply in terms of reason versus faith, but we've moved away from that now because we realize that all our beliefs are actually very difficult to defend on the basis of reason alone, and therefore we need to have a richer vision of reason which actually helps us to understand why there are so many different understandings of rationality in contemporary Western culture. I think there are two results that are worth mentioning. One of them is that many people have this idea that you only believe things that you can prove to be true. Now that is a very, very strong way of thinking, but unfortunately the only things you can prove are in the areas of logic and mathematics. And when it comes to questions like the meaning of life, or what is good, or what is the purpose of life, then I'm afraid you're never going to be able to prove any answers you give to those questions. I think people are beginning to realize this and realizing that very often the big questions of life, you have to give answers which cannot be proven to be true, even though they can be trusted to be true. That seems to me to be a very important point to make. The second point is this. I think that there's a growing realization, certainly here in England, but more widely, that the kind of atheism you find of Richard Dawkins is very shallow and very simplistic. And reality is just more complicated than he allows. And I think that one of the reasons that people are beginning to come back to religion is a realization that it tries to do justice to the complexity of the world and the complexity of human experience. Richard Dawkins offers us a very shallow engagement. We need something deeper than that to lead meaningful lives. I think it's very popular to find people saying, what I feel is what is right. And I think that there is an important point being made there, which is that people need to have a sense in their hearts, not just their minds, that something is right and exciting. So in other words, we have to recognize there's a subjective aspect to the way we think about the world. But the way you feel is not a reliable guide to the way things are. And one of the reasons I'm so attracted to Christianity is that it gives you this objective way of looking at the world, but an objective way with deep subjective implications. In other words, the way I think affects the way I feel, my head and my heart come together. And that seems to me to be a very positive, very constructive, and very helpful way of engaging with the world. I think that many people believe that science is the most reliable form of human knowledge. And I want to say that I understand why people think that. But what we need to realize is that science keeps changing its mind. It's on a journey. And that means that what science believes today, it might not believe in 10, 20, or 100 years' time. For example, 100 years ago, people thought that the universe had been here forever. Now we know it came into being. So science is always provisional. And also science is not good at explaining things to do with morality or meaning. Those are very, very important things for human beings. We want to know what is right. We want to know what the meaning of life is. And science actually cannot answer those questions. So what I would suggest is that science is very valuable in its own area. But we need a bigger picture. Science fills in part of that bigger picture, but only part. And we need something more than that. We need a bigger picture if we're going to be able to make sense of life. And that, for me, is why science and religion can come together and help us weave this deeper and richer picture of reality. On its own, science just isn't good enough. Well, I see many people coming to agree with this, saying, look, we love science, but we realize that it does not give us the full picture. And some would say, well, knowledge is simply limited to what science can tell us, and that is the end of the story. But others would say, no, there is more to it than this, and therefore science tells us part of the story, but only part. We need to draw on other resources to have a full picture of what it means to be human, of what life is all about. And I find a growing receptivity towards that, a growing realization that we need more than science to help us understand the meaning of life and what is good and how we lead authentic and meaningful lives. I think that one of the interesting things about the movement that we sometimes call the New Atheism is that its arguments are very old. They are recycling arguments going back to the 18th century and further back. And one of the things that really interests me is that atheism is very modern in the sense that it reflects the rationalist worldview of the 18th century. And what I also find is very interesting is this, that many Christian people responding to atheism also use 18th century arguments to defend Christianity. It seems to me we really need to move into the 21st century where everything has changed. There's a realization that we have to trust certain things that cannot be proven to be true. And it seems to me that there's a greater need to engage the kind of questions that postmodernity is asking. But here's the important point. Postmodernity raises some very good questions, but there are excellent answers that can be given. And we need to make sure those answers are heard by our culture. I think that every scientific advance raises questions. It's very, very unusual for a scientific advance to, in effect, solve something. More often it opens up new questions. And certainly there are things in the fields of genetics and so on which raise deep moral questions, and we have to know what those are and begin to formulate responses to them. But one of the things I've realized is that we can learn to live with questions. By that I mean that we don't have to have absolutely compelling answers to every question that we ask. I'd be very suspicious about a worldview that gave these very neat answers to everything. In any real engagement with reality, there's always going to be this area of shadowland, this area of darkness where you don't fully understand, but nevertheless you see enough to say, this makes sense, this is right, and I can live with the amount of shadows because I trust so much the area of the picture which is lit up. Well, it's certainly true that some interpretations of quantum physics would lead you to say there are many possible worlds. Shall we just take that again? I mean, is that very noisy in the background? Okay, that's fine. We'll do it again, okay. Well, it's certainly true to say that some interpretations of quantum mechanics or cosmological theory would say the best way of explaining things is to say there are multiple universes. But that's a very controversial conclusion. I think that the thing I'd want to say is we live in this universe, and we need to make sense of this universe and each of us within it. And in many ways, that's one of the reasons why religion is so powerful, because it says we need to make sense of our own lives and this world in which we find ourselves. And that seems to me to be an extremely important point to make, that very often people find themselves confused or baffled by scientific theories because they cannot see how these help them to understand the nature and meaning of life and how they should live their lives. Well, I think in today's Christianity, there are probably three main elements. There's Catholicism, there is Orthodoxy, and there's Evangelicalism. And each of those has their own distinct identity and focus and strengths and weakness. Catholicism is very, very strong, and it has this robust intellectual tradition, which enables us to ask those hard questions and give what I think are some very good answers. And I remember reading with great delight some writings of Pope John Paul II on the relationship of science and faith. I remember thinking when I read those, this gives Catholics a real framework for making sense of science, making sense of the world, and also making sense of themselves. And orthodoxy also is, I think, developing a very robust engagement with the world and indeed with science. I think it may be a late arrival on the scene in that respect, but it is doing some very significant work. Evangelicalism has had some challenges, but it's a very significant factor in modern Christianity, especially amongst young people in the West. And I think one of the things that evangelicalism is very good at is emphasizing we need to connect the faith with the personal experiential lives of ordinary individuals. In other words, it's not enough to say, here's what Christianity believes. You have to say, here is how this transforms your lives and gives you a new sense of meaning and purpose. Evangelicalism is beginning to engage the big questions, but for me its great strength is the way in which it says we need to transform our lives. It's a religion of the heart, not simply the mind. I think, particularly when I hear American evangelicals debating evolution, I feel a little bit sad because they are focusing on something that is not of ultimate importance. That's to do with the contemporary interpretation of science. And also it's a very defensive reaction to science based on one specific way of interpreting, for example, the book of Genesis, when there are many other ways of interpreting the book of Genesis in the long history of Christianity. And in many ways, I wish evangelicals would look at Christian history and rediscover older ways of reading those texts and realizing that these respect the authority of the Bible, but offer different and more exciting ways of understanding the place of humanity, the origins of the world, and so on. The reason I referred to Protestantism or evangelicalism as Christianity's dangerous idea is that these forms of Christianity say we base our faith on the Bible, but there is no one who has absolute authority to interpret the Bible. And therefore there's a sense in which everyone is free to interpret the Bible as they believe to be right. And that leads to diversity, to debate. It means that very often Protestants or evangelicals find it very difficult to resolve debates about what Christians should believe, whereas Orthodoxy and Catholicism have a much longer history of interpretation of the Bible and have come to some settled conclusions about how best to read that text. Well, I think one of the most interesting things about modern evangelicalism is this growing realization that we need to, in effect, go back into the past and learn from the way in which Christians interpreted the Bible in the past. And that to me is very important because it means that you are breaking free from the individualism, which is very often so characteristic of evangelicalism. You're saying, let us listen to wise voices from the past. So that seems to me to be a way ahead. It's a way that many evangelicals are taking. And what is interesting, I think, is that evangelicals inside mainline churches very often find that their own tradition is able to help them here, which is very significant. I think we are living in a period of very rapid cultural change. And people are trying to work out how to respond to this. And I think many Christians find themselves puzzled by it. Some find themselves threatened by it. Some feel that the only way of coping with change is to try and stay exactly the same, very often going back to the certainties of an earlier generation. I don't really think we can do that. I think what we have to try and do is say something like this. Christianity has always had to cope with cultural change. And when we look at Christian history, we can see how in the past Christians have dealt with radical change. Maybe we can learn from the way they coped with change. But the difficulty is that if you simply say no to everything that's new, you are presenting yourself as reactionary, as defensive, even as aggressive. I think that sends out a very bad message to our culture. We need to engage positively and generously. But that does not mean simply saying we do whatever we want. It's trying to say in this new situation, we need to try and work out what Christian discipleship will look like and try and develop that in the churches. I think in the West there is growing suspicion of institutions, governments, and of course churches as well as institutions. And what we're seeing, I think, is a privatization of faith, by which I mean that faith is a matter for the individual rather than something which takes place in public institutions or public debate. One of my concerns is that many of those who talk about Christianity don't really understand what it says. And it seems to me that one of the greatest challenges the Christian churches face is to try and enable their culture to understand what Christianity really is. We have too many cultural stereotypes or past memories of what Christianity was. We need, in effect, church leaders to portray Christianity in positive, engaging, winsome ways, in effect enabling people to rediscover and reconnect with faith. Well, we're already seeing people from younger Christian countries coming to the West and helping us to rediscover what Christianity is all about. I think one of the things these people are saying to Western Christianity is that we've allowed our faith to become stale. We've lost our sense of excitement. We've become so used to it that we, in effect, lose sight of what's so important about it. It's like somebody who's so used to drinking water that they take this for granted. And then when the rivers dry up, they begin to realize, that was very, very important, but we didn't realize how important it was. We need, I think, to begin to appreciate, to begin to rediscover the vitality and excitement of faith. And maybe people from other parts of the world can help us to do this. But even if they don't, I think it's something that Western Christianity needs to do for itself. Because Christianity is not going to prosper unless people are aware of what is so exciting and so important about its vision of reality, and above all, its vision for what individual human beings are able to be and to achieve. Certainly in the West, we've seen substantial immigration from other parts of the world, which means that religious traditions from Asia, from the Middle East, and from Africa have become a living presence in the Western context. I think that's had two effects. One is that it has made Western culture realize that religion is much more diverse than simply Christianity, and actually that it matters to people who are coming to us from Asia or Africa. These faiths matter. It helps them to cope with a very challenging lifestyle. So in one sense, that has caused a new interest in religion in culture at large. But obviously it has also raised questions about what is distinct, what is different about Christianity itself. And I think we can give good answers to those questions, but we need to make sure that we are alert to those questions and are able to give those good answers. Well, here at Oxford University, we have a rich possibility of discussions between Jews and Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus about the great questions of life, including, of course, the relationship of science and faith. And I find those both exciting and challenging. They're exciting because they help me realize how wonderful and complex things are, but they're also challenging because they force me to say, well, how can I maintain my Christian position without, in effect, giving into or becoming arrogant towards these other people? So if you like, it keeps me on my toes. It means I have to be able to engage these questions, and I find that helps me to think about these things and make sure I give the best answers possible. I think Christianity is a very simple faith. It's about trusting God and realizing something about what this God is like. And as you begin to reflect on this, you begin to open up a very rich vision of faith. I think the difficulty is that sometimes we present Christianity in very complex terms, which people find very difficult to understand, and they long for something simpler. For me, Christianity is a very simple faith, but once you begin to unpack it and explore it, it's rich, it's complex, and it's satisfying. But for a lot of people, they want something simple. My concern is that many Christians are so used to dealing with the richer vision of their faith that they're unable to present Christianity in the very simple, direct way which many people in our culture are looking for. I think we need to work on that. Well, I think that's right, and certainly there are many parts of the world where Christianity is seen as opening up a very rich social vision, which actually needs to be interpreted politically. Other Christians would say, well, no, Christianity is more about a personal faith. Others would say, of course, that if you become involved in politics, you run the risk of being contaminated by power. In other words, there's this danger that because politics is about establishment, it's about power, that anyone who is religious, who becomes involved in the political life, will become contaminated as a result of that. I want to acknowledge those concerns. I think that Christians in effect, should be able to think through what the political implications of their faith might be, in terms of personal responsibilities, in terms of human rights, in terms of the way we behave towards each other, in terms of a vision of what a nation is all about. But I also want to be cautious, because the risk is that the means by which those ends might be achieved might themselves be damaging to faith. So I think there's a real dilemma here, and it's one that I've never resolved. But I know that I have friends who would say, we disengage with politics because we can't cope with these pressures, and others would say we have to engage, because unless we do, there will be no Christian vision in political life at all. Now, I respect both those positions. In Britain, faith is very much a part of public life, but it's not seen as a dominant political force. People have always tried to keep faith out of politics as much as possible. And that reflects Britain's history. We had a civil war here in the 17th century about religion, and we've learned from that. And we never want that to happen again. And so in a sense, the way in which religion and politics interact in Britain is based on that concern that if religion and politics become too closely engaged, this could lead to social conflict and fragmentation. Now in America, the situation is very different. Yes, America had a civil war, but it wasn't a religious civil war. It was actually a social and political war. I think Americans feel perhaps more strongly about their faith and also see a greater connection between their faith and politics than we do here in Britain. So for us in Britain, it's quite difficult for us to understand American politics because religion plays a much bigger role there than it does here. Having said that, many of us are slightly concerned that the way in which faith is such a major element in political debates there might be damaging for faith, and that's a real concern for us. I think that we've seen the rise of new technology, smartphones, laptops, a whole series of things which make it much more easy for individuals to access information without the need to interact with other people. I think this is religiously important because what we are seeing is the rise of a generation who in effect do not ask their friends or do not consult their friends, but simply take out their phone and look it up on Google. And my concern is this, that the way in which we learn how to relate to other people is through socialization. And very often the technology of mobile phones, the technology of laptops, in effect makes us disengage with other people. And religiously, this has a very important implication, that for most Christian churches, you go to a church service to socialize and to worship God. But certainly here in Britain, and even more in the United States, we're seeing a growing movement whereby people will stay at home and watch worship services on their TVs or on their laptops. They're not connected socially. They simply are watching something else happening. It seems to me we're losing something there. That worries me. Well, the movement we call transhumanism is saying that we can enhance human beings technologically so we will live for 500 years. And that seems very nice, but I wonder about what's going to happen if that is the case, because if we live for 500 years, this world is going to be hopelessly overpopulated. And that means we compete, we go to war over very scarce resources. And I think the difficulty is that technological enhancement of humanity doesn't just give us some good things like better health. It also means that because we live longer, we're more likely to fight each other and might actually end up being the first species who actually achieves self-extinction. For me, one of the most important debates in contemporary culture is about the nature of human beings. And that's very important because if we enhance human beings technologically, what are we actually doing? The real risk is that we end up producing human beings who are able to do far more than they used to be able to, but are still radically selfish. And the result is that they are now able to do more selfish things more effectively. And the social and political implications of that could be enormous. And for me, we do need to recognize there is something wrong with us, which means that if we're able to do more, we're likely to do things badly. And we really need to be very realistic about who we are, our limitations, our biases, and try to realize that technological enhancement is not going to sort that out. We need some way of coping with who we are. And for me, one of the most important things that religion can say in our contemporary culture is, look at yourself. What do you see? You see someone who is potentially wonderful, but in actuality tends to do some very strange and very worrying things. We need to find some way of coping with the enigma of human nature before we start enhancing ourselves without thinking through what that's actually going to do. What I feel about this reluctance to engage the problem of human nature is a feeling that we can divert attention away from it, saying, look what technology can do, make things better. Well, maybe it can, but the difficulty is that we remain human beings with an inbuilt tendency to do things that actually could be destructive. And my real concern is that we may develop a technological means to exercise that destructiveness far more widely than is the case at the moment. So I'm worried. I think I need to say it very, very honestly. I do hope things work out well, but I'm also worried because in the past, when human beings have invented something new, very often that can be used for good. It can also be used for evil. The discovery of aspects of nuclear technology can mean that we can heal cancer through radiotherapy, but we can also develop bombs which will kill people through massive exposures to radiation. The science is the same. It's just one uses it for medical purposes, the other as a weapon of mass destruction. The problem is we do both those things. Why? When I was an atheist as a young man, I took the view that human nature was fundamentally good, and therefore that technology would be good and allow us to be even better. I don't think that anymore. I think that human beings are ambivalent, ambiguous, and technology makes us even more ambivalent and ambiguous. And if we were good, there wouldn't be a problem. But I don't think we are good. I think there's a risk that we're, in effect, developing technologies that could lead not simply to our own destruction, but to the destruction of this planet. And that really worries me. Well, certainly some are skeptical about the idea of climate change, feeling that this is something that is being fabricated by some politically motivated scientists or exploited by people with vested interests in green sources of energy. And I can understand that. For me, you go with the science. And it does seem to me that the science is saying our world is changing and that we are changing it. And therefore we need to work out what we can do to either minimize or eliminate the changes we are seeing. I think that the science is reasonably clear, but I think that there are many who feel that this is being hyped up or exaggerated by those with vested interests. And I think that my own feeling is that there's a real need for persuasion here. In other words, for those who are scientists who are convinced this is the case, to communicate this more effectively and be more sensitive to the needs and concerns of the audiences that they're communicating with. I think there's been a sort of a feeling that this is a scientific elite preaching to the rest of us. They need, in effect, to see themselves as trying to be communicators who are simply saying, look, here are the reasons for thinking this is the case. Here's what we might be able to do about it. What do you think? And certainly one of the major themes in postmodern culture is that argument is there, it's about ideas, but there's something much more important than argument, which is about the quality of life. And in many ways, the question that most people are asking is not so much about Christian ideas. I mean, those can be discussed, and I assure you they can be defended very, very well indeed. But there's something else there. It's about the quality of life that arises when you, in effect, appropriate and live out those ideas and values. And it seems to me that Richard Dawkins and other new atheists are saying that they see the quality of lifestyle of Christians as being inferior to that of atheists. I think I would have to say I find that a slightly shallow judgment. That one of the most interesting pieces of social research done in the United States recently was looking at the impact of religious faith on giving to charity. And the impact of religion there really is very, very significant indeed. So I would want to question this. I think that a new atheist assumption that somehow living a religious life makes you inferior to a rationalist or atheist is simply indefensible. But there is a very important point to be made here. And it's this, that very often Christianity is judged not by its ideas, but by the quality of the lives of those who call themselves Christians. And that seems to me to be a very important point. Anyone listening to this conversation needs to go away with this idea. It's the way that Christians behave that may well cause what people think about what Christianity is and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. In postmodernity, very often the question people ask is not so much, is this right, but does this work? In other words, what's the outcome? And Christians need to show that faith leads to good outcomes in life. Now, I think that can be done, but it's very good to be reminded that it needs to be done.